In the last 50 years, over $1.2 trillion of aid money has poured into Africa. That is more than the entire gross domestic product of countries like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. You would think with that kind of money, poverty would be virtually eliminated. But here is the shocking reality. When Western aid programs began in earnest during the 1960s, just 11% of Africans lived in extreme poverty. By the 1990s, after decades of aid campaigns and billions in donations, that number had skyrocketed to 66%. Today it stands at 38%, over 3 times higher than when the whole program started. The numbers tell an even grimmer story when you look at comparative wealth. Back in the 1950s, the average Western European was about 5 times richer than the average African. Now that gap has more than doubled to 13 times. Today, over half of all Africans still survive on less than $5.50 per day. Nearly 600 million people lack access to electricity. This is not just a recent problem either. Africa has trailed behind global economic development for centuries, but for the past 60 years, the West's solution has been remarkably simple. They are poor because they do not have enough money. To fix poverty, we simply need to give them more. So that is exactly what happened. Since the 1960s, aid flowing into Africa has increased by nearly 120 times. On paper, this strategy makes perfect sense. Build schools, pave roads, vaccinate children. These are the same investments that transformed Europe and America into economic powerhouses. But in Africa, something has gone terribly wrong, and a growing body of economic research suggests the aid money is not just being wasted, it is actually making the continent poorer. The question is why? And if you are enjoying this deep dive into one of economics' biggest puzzles, make sure to subscribe for more content examining the financial forces shaping our world. To understand why aid fails in Africa, we need to look at the one time it spectacularly succeeded. After World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were bombed out, factories destroyed, transportation networks shattered. But the economic devastation came with a massive geopolitical risk. Across Western Europe, communist parties were gaining popularity fast. Without economic recovery, there was genuine fear that Western Europe could either vote for communism or be invaded by the Soviet Union. For the United States, this scenario would be catastrophic. In 1947, the American government announced one of history's most ambitious economic programs, the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States pumped over $13 billion into Europe, roughly $160 billion in today's money. The economic theory was straightforward: provide large amounts of capital to jumpstart investment and economic activity. Money would rebuild factories, repair infrastructure, and get people back to work. Those workers would then spend their wages, creating demand for goods and services, which would justify even more investment. Remarkably, it worked. In the decade following the Marshall Plan, gross domestic product per capita across Western Europe grew by almost 35%. For the Western world, this was validation of a powerful idea. Foreign aid could rapidly transform economies. But for America, it represented something more. Through strategic aid, the United States could create wealthy trading partners and secure long-term allies against communism. With the Marshall Plan's success fresh in memory, American policymakers turned their attention to another continent, Africa. At the time, Africa seemed ripe for transformation. The continent was emerging from centuries of brutal colonialism. In 1960, average income in sub-Saharan Africa was less than $150 per year. Literacy rates hovered below 30%. Life expectancy was around 45 years. Most regions lacked paved roads, functioning electricity grids, or stable governments. But Africa also possessed something America desperately wanted: natural resources. The continent held massive reserves of oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals critical for modern industry. With a rapidly growing population, Africa looked like a future economic giant waiting to happen. American strategists believed they could replicate the Marshall Plan's success, flood the continent with capital, build infrastructure, and watch economies take off. The money started flowing immediately. During the 1960s, sub-Saharan Africa received about $500 million in aid annually. By the 1990s, that figure had exploded 40 times over to nearly $20 billion per year. Africa quickly became the most aid-dependent region on Earth. By the 90s, foreign aid money accounted for over 60% of government budgets in countries like Uganda, Malawi, and Burkina Faso. But despite this massive injection of capital, economic conditions deteriorated. From 1970 to 2000, average income in Africa actually declined even as the continent received almost $600 billion in aid. Rather than questioning the strategy, the West doubled down. In 2005, the United Nations launched the Millennium Development Goals. The Group of Eight promised to double aid to Africa with the stated goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030. This was no longer just government policy, it had become a cultural movement. Campaigns like Comic Relief in the United Kingdom, Live Aid, and Band-Aid's Feed the World turned African poverty into a moral crusade. Ordinary citizens donated millions. Schools held fundraisers, celebrities recorded charity singles, all under the belief that money alone could solve the problem. By 2010, aid flows to Africa reached over $50 billion annually, the highest in history. Yet nearly 2 decades later, the results are devastating. 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 per day, the highest absolute number ever recorded. The continent's share of global trade remains below 3%. Many countries are now poorer than they were in the 1980s. This raises the fundamental economic question: why did the same aid strategy that rebuilt Europe completely fail in Africa? Economists have proposed various explanations ranging from geography to colonial history, but one theory has gained significant traction among development experts: institutions. In economics, institutions are the frameworks that govern society. Things like rule of law, property rights, transparent legal systems, and democratic accountability. These might be the single most important factor explaining why aid made Africa poorer. When the Marshall Plan began, Western Europe already possessed functioning state institutions, government ministries, court systems, tax collection agencies, regulatory bodies. Though damaged by war, these institutions had existed for decades or even centuries. They provided the framework necessary for economic reconstruction. Governments could collect taxes, distribute resources efficiently, enforce contracts, and maintain law and order. These are all essential functions for a stable market economy, but Africa's situation was fundamentally different. Most African nations had only recently gained independence. Their governments were either newly formed or inherited directly from colonial administrations. In both cases, the institutions were designed for one primary purpose: extracting wealth. Unlike Western democracies where institutions theoretically served public interests, many African states functioned almost entirely to benefit ruling elites. This is not speculation. Indexes tracking government institutional quality consistently rank African countries near the bottom. In 2025, African nations comprise nearly half of the bottom 30 countries on the Polity Democracy ranking, a widely respected measure of democratic governance. When you pour hundreds of billions of dollars into states with weak institutions, the money does not flow where it is intended. Funds allocated for roads, schools, hospitals, and electrification often disappear into the hands of ruling elites. Stories abound of African presidents flying private jets to international development conferences or government ministers spotted wearing $60,000 Rolex watches at anti-poverty meetings. Estimates suggest corruption drains approximately $30 billion from Africa annually. That is roughly 30% of all aid money received over 50 years, potentially amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars stolen. But corruption is not just wasteful, it actively reinforces the very institutional weaknesses that prevent development. In functional democracies, governments are primarily funded through taxation. This creates a reciprocal relationship between state and citizens. People pay taxes and in return expect services: roads, schools, police, healthcare. If the government fails to deliver, citizens can demand reform or vote for new leadership. This accountability mechanism is fundamental to good governance. In aid-dependent countries, this mechanism breaks completely. Governments receive funding from foreign donors, not their own citizens. As a result, leaders do not need public approval to maintain power and access resources. Corruption can persist with minimal domestic resistance because the people being harmed have no financial leverage over their government. Malawi provides a textbook example. During the 2000s and early 2010s, foreign aid made up over 40% of the national budget at various points. Meanwhile, massive amounts of money were being stolen by government officials. Public funds paid for luxury cars, private mansions, and international shopping trips. In any normal democracy, such scandals would spark mass outrage and political consequences. After all, government officials were stealing millions meant to serve the public. But in Malawi, there was virtually no political fallout. Since government funding came from foreign sources rather than domestic taxes, Malawian citizens had very little power to demand systemic change. The people most affected by mismanagement had no meaningful recourse. This dynamic has repeated across the continent for decades. It explains in part why corruption remains so entrenched despite generations of anti-corruption campaigns. Some level of corruption exists in virtually every country, especially during early development. But typically, countries can still achieve economic growth through grassroots entrepreneurship. Small businesses, farmers, and local entrepreneurs drive progress from the ground up, creating jobs and expanding markets without heavy reliance on government. But foreign aid makes this bottom-up development much harder. Aid often directly competes with local businesses, undermining the very entrepreneurs who could drive organic growth. The textile industry illustrates this perfectly. By the early 2000s, nearly 80% of clothing sold in some African nations came from abroad, often as donated goods from Western aid organizations. On the surface, this seems beneficial. Cheap clothes for consumers, feel-good waste reduction for donors, but the effect on African industry was catastrophic. In Ghana alone, over 80% of domestic textile factories shut down between 1990 and 2010. Thousands of jobs vanished. With them disappeared the knowledge, machinery, supply chains, and business networks needed to sustain homegrown industry. This pattern repeated across sectors. In the last 2 decades, Africa's industrial sector has actually shrunk from 15% of the continent's economy to just 10%. This is not coincidence. Academic research confirms that on average, foreign aid hurts industrialization in Africa. Even the World Bank, one of the world's largest aid organizations, found that periods of increased aid tend to weaken local manufacturing. The damage extends beyond individual industries. Aid distorts entire economic structures in ways that make long-term growth nearly impossible. To understand why, consider how countries actually become wealthy. Over the past few decades, almost every nation achieving rapid development has followed an export-led growth model. South Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, all these countries experienced explosive growth by manufacturing low-cost goods, selling them to Western consumers, and using the revenue to industrialize. Over time, they built domestic industries, accumulated capital and expertise, and eventually moved up the value chain to produce higher quality goods. But there is a crucial element people often overlook: maintaining a weak currency. A cheaper currency makes exports more affordable on global markets, boosting foreign demand. This increased demand helps local industries expand, creating jobs and bringing in foreign income, which further fuels development. It is a virtuous economic cycle, but aid money creates the exact opposite effect. When large amounts of foreign aid flow into a country, that money must be converted into local currency so governments and organizations can actually spend it. This conversion process increases demand for the local currency on foreign exchange markets. Basic supply and demand principles tell us what happens next. The currency's value rises. At first glance, a stronger currency might not seem problematic, but for developing economies, it is disastrous. A more expensive currency means exports become more expensive for foreign buyers. If you are a factory in Nairobi competing with factories in Vietnam or Bangladesh, and your currency suddenly becomes 30% more valuable, your products become 30% more expensive on world markets. Foreign buyers simply stop purchasing your goods. For developing economies, this is catastrophic. The export-led model that works successfully in East Asia becomes impossible to replicate. Today in Africa, exports account for roughly 20% of average gross domestic product. That is less than half the export share of successful East Asian economies like Hong Kong, South Korea, or Taiwan at comparable development stages. Instead of developing competitive industries and shipping products worldwide, aid-dependent countries end up trapped in a cycle. They rely on foreign assistance to survive while their domestic economies remain uncompetitive and underdeveloped. The very aid meant to help them escape poverty actually blocks the main pathway countries use to become wealthy. Of course, aid could theoretically still work if it effectively filled crucial development gaps. Building roads, schools, and power grids should facilitate domestic economic expansion even if other problems exist. But this brings us to perhaps the most serious issue with foreign aid. It almost never delivers effectively. A 2012 report by the Center for Global Development found that up to 70% of aid projects either failed to meet targets or showed no measurable impact. In some sectors, waste was staggering. An audit of health aid in Uganda discovered nearly 1/3 of donated medical supplies never reached intended recipients. The supplies were lost to theft, mismanagement, or simple logistical failure. In Haiti, after the devastating 2010 earthquake, billions in aid poured in, yet less than 10% reached local institutions. Most was routed through foreign contractors, non-governmental organizations, or absorbed by overhead costs. More than a decade later, many communities still lack basic sanitation or permanent housing. To understand why aid delivery fails so consistently, compare it to systems that function effectively. Consider a business operating in a competitive market. If it provides a poor product, consumers switch to competitors. The firm's revenues drop. If it fails to improve, it may go bankrupt. The key point is accountability. The people providing the product are accountable to the people using it. Market forces reward success and punish failure, but foreign aid does not work this way. When projects fail, recipients cannot withhold payment or choose alternative providers. Funding comes from foreign governments or international donors, not the people actually affected. There is no mechanism rewarding success or punishing failure. The result is an enormous lack of incentive to deliver quality outcomes. Aid organizations and contractors get paid regardless of results. This fundamental misalignment of incentives virtually guarantees poor performance. The story of foreign aid in Africa is not simply one of failure. It is a story of misplaced assumptions and unintended economic consequences. What began as a genuine effort to lift nations from poverty has created systems of dependence, weakened institutions, and stifled local industries. None of this means aid has no role whatsoever. In moments of acute crisis like famine, armed conflict, or natural disasters, aid provides vital short-term relief. Emergency assistance saves lives when immediate needs overwhelm local capacity. But as a long-term development strategy, the economic evidence is impossible to ignore. Aid has not delivered the transformation it promised. If the genuine goal is supporting sustainable growth, the focus must shift dramatically. Instead of simply transferring money, development efforts should prioritize building strong institutions, supporting local businesses, and creating systems where governments are accountable to their people rather than foreign donors. This means helping countries establish transparent legal systems, independent judiciaries, and functioning tax collection that creates the accountability loop between citizens and government. It means supporting local entrepreneurs and manufacturers rather than competing with them. It means understanding that development is not just about money. It is about creating the institutional frameworks and economic incentives that allow societies to generate wealth themselves. Because until that fundamental shift happens, the cycle of dependency will simply continue. Africa does not need charity. It needs the economic and institutional foundations that allow its people to build prosperity for themselves.